Slavery has been in the news lately thanks to what Rush Limbaugh did not say about it. As noted in an earlier post, the attacks on Limbaugh have been utterly shameless, and it is impossible to respect any person that would stoop to such scandalous depths as to smear anyone with such an accusation. But for the record, and since I do not have a radio program and do not intend to run for public office, I want to give a brief overview of slavery, the truth about it, something you will never hear from the mainstream media or anyone on the left. I'm going to have to divide this into two videos because YouTube limits the length of the videos. Slavery was an economic system just like capitalism, socialism, or mercantilism. Since every society in human history prior to the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century was agricultural, slavery was very common all over the world as a cheap, free form of labor. Quite often, captives of war were sold into slavery. It was never a terribly efficient form of labor, simply because the slave had no incentive to work other than his fear of punishment, which quite often was incentive enough. In some places, like in the American South, slaves could be rewarded for good behavior or good labor with a new suit of clothes, a weekend pass, that sort of thing. But still, a slave never enjoyed the fruits of his own labor, thus the motivations were all outward. As noted, slavery existed everywhere. Folks, it is no surprise that slavery existed in North America and in the United States. Indeed, it would have been surprising had it not. Initially, slavery existed in all of the 13 original American colonies. It died out in the North simply because it did not pay, not because of some superior moral virtue of the people of that region. In fact, slavery is not condemned by any of the world's major religions, Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. They all regulate it, but none condemns it because they all arose in a cultural environment where slavery was simply accepted. Almost 1 in 3 people in the Roman Empire were slaves. Jesus never said a word about it, at least not recorded in the Bible, but he and his apostles did counsel proper treatment of all men, and the Apostle Paul had some direct things to say about slavery in his letters to Ephesus and Colossae. What is interesting here is that slavery, again, was simply accepted as a cultural norm. When Onesimus, who was a slave of Paul's Christian friend Philemon, when Onesimus ran away, nobody ever liked being in slavery, the apostle sent him back with a letter counseling Philemon to accept the slave back without punishment. Paul did not tell his slave-owning friend that he was a wicked sinner and that he needed to free all his slaves immediately. Indeed, Paul told the slave owner to forgive the slave for running away from him. Not exactly modern American leftist democratic philosophy, is it? Slavery still exists today in some of the more remote parts of the world, but it is a sex slavery, not agricultural. The institution died for 2 reasons. First, the principles of Western civilization that all men are created equal. It is noteworthy not that the West had slavery, but that it was the first major civilization to turn against it. And when it did so, it was against the strong wishes of Africans, Muslims, and others who were getting quite wealthy, thank you, selling slaves to Western plantations. The second reason slavery ended was the Industrial Revolution. When people started working for wages, they did not want competition from free labor. Again, slavery worked fairly well in an agricultural society, where nearly everyone made their living off the land. But when a larger and larger number of people began working for wages, they demanded the end of slavery. Yet, when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, which incidentally did not free one single slave, there were riots in the North against it, as Northern workers feared that the freedmen would gravitate to that region and take jobs for cheaper wages than whites would work for. Besides, Northerners didn't like darkies any more than Southerners did. Alexis de Tocqueville said the North was more bigoted than the South. 3 northern states prior to the Civil War wrote it into their state constitutions that they would not even let blacks into the state. The myth of Northern love for blacks is just that, a myth perpetuated by Northern historians to justify the Civil War and continue to bring shame and reproach against the Southern states. Folks, these 2 regions of the country have never gotten along, even in earliest colonial times. The New England colonies were settled largely by English Puritans. The Southern colonies were settled largely by English aristocrats. Those 2 groups fought a civil war in England in the 1640s, and they fought another one in America in the 1860s. The roots of the conflict were that deep, and they still exist. In the second video on this subject, we will talk about the American Civil War and its relationship to slavery.